Good afternoon, and welcome to another discussion in the 2020 election series that the Baker Institute is sponsoring this fall. I'm John Williams, and along with today's moderator, Mark Jones, the two of us are fellows at the Baker Institute's Presidential Elections Program. Today, Mark is joined by two of the top journalists in Texas and frankly, around the country, and both are with the Texas Tribune, which has broken new ground in nonprofit journalism since hanging out at Shingles. Cassandra Pollock is a rising star at the Trib. She joined the Tribune full-time in 2017 after her fellowship there during the 85th Texas legislative session. A graduate of the University of Texas School of Journalism, she spent her first 2 years at the Trib as an engagement reporter. Today, she's the state's top politics reporter. Ross Ramsey, executive editor and co-founder of the Tribune, has a long, distinguished resume that includes stints at the Texas Weekly, which he owned, the Houston Chronicle, and Dallas Times-Herald. He's an expert traffic cop at the intersection of politics and public policy, and his regular column, Unconventional Wisdom, is a must-read for those who want to know how Texas really works. Today, Cassandra, Ross, and Mark will discuss races in the Texas House of Representatives that could affect the balance of power of partisan power in a state that's been almost totally controlled by Republicans since 2002. In 2002, Republicans took a majority of the House seats for the first time since Reconstruction. More is at stake in these key elections than during usual years. The next legislature will look closely at the congressional seats and determine the reapportionment of the seats. That in turn will play a key role in determining the partisan makeup of the state's congressional delegation in Washington. As a result, Republicans in Texas around Texas and Democrats around Texas and the nation are watching to see how these races unfold. Cassandra, Ross, Mark, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Cassie and Ross. Thanks for being here. So I guess to start things off, today we are talking about the Texas House, and that's pretty down in the weeds. Normally we have a presidential election, Senate, U.S. House. So why are we talking about the Texas House, and why should people care, both here in Texas, and why do we see such national interest in it with all the national money coming in from the coast as well as elsewhere in the country? Ross?
Yeah, the Texas House is down in the weeds, and it's kind of surprising to see national money in Texas House races. It's a 150-member House. As you said, the state government, or as John said, the state government is Republican right now. We have a Republican governor, Republican Senate, Republican House, but the Democrats are 9 seats away from regaining the majority that they lost in 2002, and they're very hopeful about it. And it doesn't really give them, if they won the House, it wouldn't give them the power necessarily to pass legislation, but it would give them a new power to stop legislation, because you have to have the House and the Senate and the governor to get something through. And that includes the redistricting maps that'll be drawn by the next legislature. So the national play here is if you can win a majority in the House, and if the timing of the census is just right, then the Democrats might be able to get a map that's better, if not great, but better than what the Republicans would draw, or the courts will do it for them. It's kind of a long way around the bend, but it's been enough to attract millions and millions of dollars into Texas House races and into the infrastructure of a Texas Democratic Party that's been pretty moribund for the last 20, 25 years.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Cassie, so what can you tell us about the national money and national interest? Like, what national forces are coming into these races, and how are they doing it?
Yeah, I think you have over 24 Democrat-aligned groups easily. That's probably way more than that at this point, that are really just laser focused on these Texas House races. They the most recent campaign finance reporting period showed that sorry, Tyler, what's that? Sorry, guys. I'm going to put myself on mute. If Ross, you want to go?
Yeah. Go ahead, Ross.
Sure. You've got, a bunch of money coming in from all of these national groups. Eric Holder's group, the former attorney general under Barack Obama has been spending a lot of his time and energy on voting issues, including redistricting. And I think, in a national sense, kind of lit the fire on, hey, watch what's happening in Texas. We could change some seats. You can credit these kinds of programs really to Tom DeLay, who was a former congressman from Sugar Land in Fort Bend, who came into Texas after the Republicans took the legislature in 2002. They wanted to redraw the redistricting maps that had been drawn the year before by the Democrats. And it was unusual. A lot of people thought it was illegal. It turned out not to be, to come in mid-decade and say, hey, we're going to redraw these maps. DeLay led the charge. The idea was increase the number of Republicans in the Texas congressional delegation by 3 or 4 seats, and you'll change the U.S. House, because it was at that time in the margins like that. DeLay wanted to be speaker, and so change his own state, get a majority, maybe bada bing, bada boom. He was successful at that, and he never did become speaker, but it did light everyone's imagination. And now the Democrats are playing the same hand in a way. If we can, they would say, get a hold of the Texas House, then maybe we can tilt the maps enough to get 2 or 3 seats out of the Texas delegation, maybe a couple of seats from other delegations around the country, and solidify the Democratic majority in the U.S. House. And they've gotten far enough along in their thinking and in their development and in their organization to raise millions and millions of dollars, to the point where now we've got a situation in Texas where, rather than an election driven by money at the top, like the 2018 election when Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz were spending 1 bazillion simoleons, I think it was $175 million at the end of it. Rather than a race like that, we've got all of this money coming into the middle. It's coming into the legislative races, and it may be that candidates up the ballot from there, judicial candidates, Senate candidates, congressional candidates, will actually benefit from people below them on the ballot and the money flowing into these Texas House races.
Okay. Thanks, Ross. Now, so let's get even further into the weeds. So we're talking about this idea that Democrats need a net gain of 9 seats to flip the Texas House. And back in 2018, they narrowed it. So they were able to flip 12 Republican seats. They didn't lose any. So they narrowed it to an 83 to 67 majority for Republicans. So they're within a 9-seat gap. So Cassie, let's first talk about what do Democrats have to defend? They won 12 seats last time around. Are any of those seats vulnerable? And if so, which ones probably appear the most vulnerable? So if Republicans have any hope of actually taking anything back, where would you find those seats?
Yeah, so I think that Republicans are mainly focused on, in addition to about a dozen other seats that I think are in play for both parties, they're focused on those 12 that Dems flipped last cycle. A lot of them are kind of competitive to begin with. And Republicans since, I guess, November 2018 have been focused on them. So you have a number of races kind of in the suburbs in Dallas County and in Harris County, a couple over in, the western part of Austin. And, that's where a lot of this money's going. So, one race that I have been trying to follow is the HD 132 race. Gina Kalani, she beat Mike Schofield, the former Republican state rep there, who, held the seat by just about 100 votes last cycle. So I think Republicans are viewing that. I know that we'll get into it in a bit, but name ID, they're hoping that Schofield kind of has the sort of name ID that could maybe, make a bigger difference this cycle with the end of straight ticket voting. And then the other one that I think a lot of people are talking about how it's going to play out is Morgan Meyer's race in Dallas. His Democrat opponent, who nearly defeated him in 2018 by, just a few dozen votes, is running again for the seat. And you kind of have the same issues at play there. It's a suburb. Both seats are, heavily targeting or, heavily focusing on that race. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Ross, are there any other Democrats that you think should be sweating a little bit other than Gina Kalani?
Yeah, I think, there were a number of races last time that I called the bareleys. They either barely won or they barely lost. And, that's kind of where my eye goes first in some of these races. Michelle Beckley had a narrow win in the Carrollton area. I'm terrible with district numbers, so this is one of my blind spots. But it's a race up in the southern Denton County, northern Dallas County area. There was another race there. Retta Bowers won. There was another close race. There were a couple of races like the Morgan Meyer race where the incumbent barely held on. So these are where, the party's first blush look at candidates and at target lists is going to be look at the margins and all of the races in the House, figure out which endings were within 5 points. Some of these endings were within 2 percentage points where a candidate beat another candidate 51-49. And if maybe you'd knocked on doors on another couple of blocks, you would have won a race. So I think there are races like that. Rosenthal in Harris County is one of those. The Zwiener race, Aaron Zwiener won a race in previously Republican Hayes County and Comal County that I think the Republicans are going to go hard at. But, a lot of this is first you look at the environment in a district and you try to figure out which of these districts look like it's actually structurally close between the parties. And then you begin to look at other external factors. Which of the races in 2018 were close, really just because Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz were, battling it out and it got a bunch of voters excited. Which of them were close because the personalities of the candidates or information about the candidates was positive or negative in a way that, influenced the race, knocked it out of its saddle, and which ones of them were environmental. And I think we've probably got, a dozen environmental races, by which I mean on a given day, the Republicans or the Democrats could win.
Okay, so that's sort of the Democratic. So what we've talked a little bit about those Democratic races. So Retta Bowers, John Rosenthal, Gina Kalani, maybe John Turner, Michelle Beckley, or sort of some of the more vulnerable, Aaron Zwiener, some of the more vulnerable Democrats. And Cassie, and both you and Cassie mentioned Morgan Meyer. We're the more vulnerable Republicans. For Democrats, remember, Democrats need a net gain of 9 seats. So in addition to protecting their say 7 to 12 vulnerable seats, they need to start picking off Republicans. Where's the lowest hanging fruit other than Morgan Meyer, who you mentioned?
One race that comes to mind is Sarah Davis's race. It's HD 134, Houston area. And the reason why, I think Democrats are feeling pretty good about their chances in that district. Again, you can take all the caveats that you'd like for 18 and Beto at the top of the ticket, but he carried that district by a little over 20 percentage points, right? So that district went overwhelmingly, voted overwhelmingly Democratic just 2 years ago. So that's one race that immediately comes to mind. What about you, Ross?
Angie Chen Button is another race in Dallas County. There's a lot of this concentrated, there are races around the state and there's some in Houston and other areas, but there's a big concentration of competitive races in the Dallas area, some of them in unexpected spots. Angie Chen Button represents a part of northeastern Dallas County that used to be sort of classic Republican territory around the old, TI headquarters, Texas Instruments headquarters. And then in Collin County, which has been, a friend of mine in Dallas calls it Red Square. It's a square county. It's been solidly Republican for a long time and very conservative Republicans. But Matt Shaheen and Jeff Leach, two Republican state reps from up there, had unexpectedly close races and are fighting like they're fighting on uphill ground this time. I think there are a number of places where the Democrats are optimistic that they can pick up. I think the hesitation I've got about that is that the Democrats are trying to improve by 9 seats, one of their best election years in 2 decades. They won 12 seats last time. They barely won some of those. And they're saying not only can we win those seats back and hold the ones that were close, but we can do 9 seats better. And that is entirely possible, but I think it's a little bit of a stretch.
Okay, thanks. I mean, and Dallas County mentioned is interesting in that after the massacre that Republicans suffered back in 2018, Angie Chen Button and Morgan Meyer are the only 2 left. We could find ourselves in a situation where there's not a single Republican representing Dallas County, which is also, I think, an interesting point. Since in redistricting, one thing we've talked about is congressional redistricting. For the state House and state Senate, Republicans are still going to control that, probably if Democrats take a majority through the legislative redistricting board. So like Dallas County is an interesting place where this may be a high water mark for Democrats, as once Republicans get a chance to redraw the maps, it may improve. So Ross, we've talked about the sort of Matt Shaheen, Jeff Leach in Collin County, Sarah Davis in down Harris County, Angie Chin-Button in Dallas County, and then maybe some of the open seats in Harris County and Tarrant County. Where are that's still, if we add all those up together, we still aren't up at 9. So where do you think the Republican firewall is? That is, that if you're a Republican, where are you looking at as your last line of defense between keeping your majority and losing it? Where should we be watching on election night? Say,
I would watch the ring in Dallas. I would watch Tarrant County, Denton County, Collin County. I think the Dallas County itself is a little bit different, and particularly inside the city of Dallas, that's pretty blue territory now. Tarrant County is interesting. In certain parts of, if you look at the county as a whole, it's still red, although Beto O'Rourke won there. And they've got some solidly Republican seats, but they've got a lot of outlying seats or central seats, Fort Worth, that have gone blue already. And they've got some suburban seats that are showing some of the same kinds of erosion that we've been seeing in Republican strength in the counties in Texas that the Republicans used to rely on, not only for local elections, but for statewide elections. Fort Bend, Montgomery, Williamson, Denton, Dallas, Rockwall, or Denton, Collin, Rockwall. Tarrant's not really a suburb, but it behaved like one. Those counties are starting to erode some, and where we're seeing that erosion is in these House seats. So I think whenever you've got an open seat, there's one that's open in Harris County, there's another open seat in Fort Bend County, there's an open seat in Tarrant County. I think those are going to be highly contested and pretty good petri dishes for, nerds like us to go back on November 4th or 5th or whenever we have a final vote to look at to see what happened and whether what we thought might be a trend when we looked at the 2018 election was actually a trend. We'll get another data point.
Thanks, Cassie.
Yes, completely agree with Ross. I mean, you have the seat in San Antonio. Steve Allison is a Republican who currently represents that seat. And, that's gotten a lot of talk in terms of, can Democrats actually flip that? Can Democrats flip Brad Buckley's seat? Can Democrats flip Eb Thompson's seat? There's even been some talk of whether Democrats could flip Todd Hunter's seat down in Corpus Christi. And so you have, seats that never have really gotten much play in the sense of being considered or deemed by one party or the other competitive, and they're being talked about like they're on the board this time. So I'm, in addition to the big seats, the big clusters of seats in Dallas and Tarrant County, I'm curious what happens in those races. Selena Montoya, the Democrat challenging Steve Allison this morning, I believe, announced, a $1 million sort of ad buy, in the home stretch of Election Day. So, it's just a lot of momentum that the Democrats are trying to project into races that, again, have never really been called into question in terms of competitiveness before.
Thanks. So both of you have already commented on this. This is the first election in Texas that we won't have straight ticket voting. And so that is going to lead to what we call roll-off, or people not voting in down ballot races. Now, for most Texans, the state house race doesn't occur till the 10th, 11th, or 12th race, depending on where you live. What are you thinking about roll-off? How large will it be? Do you think it's going to benefit one party or the other, or is it too tough to tell right now, Cassie?
Personally, for me, too tough to call. Both sides are again trying to message this enthusiasm heading into Election Day. I think I've noted this in just our coverage, and I know other reporters have too. But one thing worth noting here is Republicans in these state house races, and just up and down the ballot more generally, have resumed in-person campaign events. I'm talking about knocking on doors, hosting in-person campaign rallies and whatnot, like much sooner than Dems, and in some cases, just all Dems aren't doing anything to that effect quite yet. Everything's still virtual. So I wonder if any of that's going to have any sort of an impact again in these more local races that we're talking about here. In terms of name ID or recognition and activity in those districts.
You get charismatic races on a ticket. And obviously the race on this one, where the two sort of charismatic, attention-grabbing candidates is the presidential race. And, I think there's going to be a significant amount of fall off between the presidential race and the whole rest of the ballot. I think there's going to be a drop right there. But, the straight ticket has, in a lot of ways over the years, saved or doomed partisan candidates down the ballot. If you were on the ballot in a presidential year and your party's presidential candidate did well, that probably accrued to your benefit because people might pull the lever for the Democrats in races that they might not otherwise get to, and in races where they might not, frankly, know anything about the candidates other than their party label. Places like Harris County, they've got extremely long ballots. There was a picture on social media, I think it was 4 years ago, where someone at the Harris County Clerk's office printed out the ballot before the election, printed out the ballot and held it and was holding it above her head like this. And this ballot went to the ground and curled up. And the note on the post was, "I'm 5'6". On a ballot like that, heavy smokers never make it to the end. People fade before they get to the end of a ballot like that. And it empowers other factors. So, if I can't pull a lever and vote for all the Republicans or all the Democrats, I might go into the election booth with a slate card from a civic group that I'm in, from any kind of a group that has a list of candidates. It might be my trade association, and I might vote that ticket instead of a straight Republican or a Democratic ticket. And I think things like that are much more influential as you get further down a ballot. The fewer number of voters there are in a race, the more powerful each voter is. And if those voters are organized, if you've got the ability from outside a race for something like constable or justice of the peace or even sheriff or county commissioner, you can have a really outsized effect. And I'm going to be watching for that this year without the straight ticket to compete with those folks.
Okay. Thanks, Ross. I'd like to remind all of our viewers that you can also ask questions in the Q&A function or section of the app. We'll get to those a little later on. Okay, so now let's assume election day has passed. We have, I guess, three possible scenarios. We have a narrow Democratic majority, we have a narrow Republican majority, and we have a tie. So, Cassie, let's start off. Let's assume there is a narrow Democratic majority. What do we see in terms of speaker?
I think in either a narrow Democratic or a narrow Republican majority, you're going to see some sort of coalition candidate. If Dems end up having a winning majority of the chamber by 2, 3, 4, 5 seats, a more centrist Democrat who is able to appeal to a large chunk of Republican members, I think is probably what you're going to see. And the same thing for if you have a narrow Republican majority. Just over the past few months, as talk of the speaker's race has picked up, there's been more than one reference to former House Speaker Joe Straus's election and the tight margin that the 76-74 split between Republicans and Democrats and how he was elected that first time to the gavel. So not mentioning that to say that I can see a repeat necessarily of how how Strauss won election to the gavel, but just saying that in the context of I think that the narrower the margin, the more centrist from either party, more coalition type of candidate you're going to see.
Thanks, Cassie. Ross?
I completely agree with that. I think, this is going to be a much more centrist House, particularly compared to the Senate. The Senate's kind of conservative right now. And even if the Republicans have the majority in the House, as Cassie said, the Democrats are going to be a large object in the rearview mirror. It's like the T-Rex in the Jurassic Park movies. And you're going to have to pay attention and you're going to have to count noses very carefully on your votes. It's useful when you're talking about this to remember that a lot of votes in the Texas House and in the Texas Senate aren't really along partisan lines as much as they are on the lines of, there are some issues that aren't particularly partisan that split the House and Senate in unusual ways. And, one of those may be when we get to a conversation that I'm sure we'll get to in the session about the executive power of a governor during a pandemic. There's a lot of noise coming from people in both parties about whether Greg Abbott has the power to do all of the things he's been doing, whether he should or shouldn't have that. A question like that is not necessarily a partisan question. And so you're going to find members in the House working across party lines in a way that I think blunts the conservative topspin coming from the Senate.
And what happens if we hit 75-75?
The reporter's jackpot.
I don't know if I'd call it a jackpot. I'm actually not sure, but I did want to say, like, I think regardless of which party's in control here, and with both sides more or less assuming that regardless of which party, the margin is going to be more narrow, I think there's an appetite on both sides to work with the upper chamber, work with the governor's office to pass bills, right? I don't think anybody's coming into this session in the mood to have a stalemate between a Democrat House and a Republican Senate, if that makes sense. There's too much on the table with redistricting and with the budget shortfalls that the Texas comptroller has projected, and with responding to the pandemic, and a host of other issues that while they might not all get resolved on time within 140 days, my sense is that both parties, and maybe that's part of that becomes part of a speaker candidate's pitch is, I'm going to be the speaker that oversees this really tough session with a very narrow split between the two parties, and we're going to get stuff done.
Thanks. I guess if it's a tie, we can always just call Joe Strauss out of retirement, and he could be the 151st member of the House. Take over.
One of the things that happened last time the House was split closely. Joe Strauss was elected after a 2008 election that produced 76 Republicans and 74 Democrats. If there'd been 23 votes going the other way in a district in Irving, Texas, it would have been a jump ball, would have been 75-75. But what immediately happened, and this is really in the weeds, but what immediately happened was members started talking to each other, and the list kept by this Mark Jones fellow down in Houston of how liberal and how conservative members of the Texas House are always has a middle ground where this is the Democrat who votes most closely to the Republicans, and this is the Republican who votes most closely to the Democrats. The people in that box, the most conservative Democrats and the most liberal Republicans, are going to get a lot of enticement to change parties. If you've got a tied House, for sure, because if I'm on either side and I get one person to flip, boom, we're in the majority. If I'm only a majority by a scant vote, there'll be some non-political issue that messes up one of my votes, and I'm going to be looking for insurance. So I think you're going to see a lot of arm twisting, begging, something just this side of illegal bribery to get people to change parties and join a side to create a secure majority.
Thanks. Okay, so we brought up the Senate. That's not the topic today, but I do want to just briefly delve into the Senate. Really, the only race that's competitive there is SD 19 between Pete Flores, the Republican, and Roland Gutierrez, the Democrat. What do you expect to happen there, Cassie?
I think Democrats are feeling good about how the SD 19 race could go in their favor this time. When that was a special election and when Pete Flores ended up winning, it was, Republicans were kind of seizing that win as emblematic of the Democratic Party's, inability to really rally behind their candidate in that race. And I think, as a result of that, or as a product of that, Democrats have put a lot of focus in terms of recruiting or rallying around a candidate who is trying to upgrade from his House seat and run for the Senate. So but Flores has also represented that seat for the past couple of years and has been able to represent the district, I think Republicans would say, quite well. So I think just the common thought out there, or at least the most discussed thought that I hear, is that it's probably leaning Democrat at this point. But we'll see on election day.
All right, thanks. So Ross, let's assume Cassie's right. Pete Flores loses, Roland Gutierrez wins. That then takes us to only 18 Republican senators out of 31. Do we see Dan Patrick, who once upon a time we had a 2/3 vote in the Senate, where no bill could reach the floor unless 2/3 of the senators signed off? Dan Patrick reduced that to the 3/5 rule. Will we see the end of the 3/5 rule if that occurs, if Pete Flores loses?
I think so. I mean, this is like a slow motion point shaving routine, right? He's going to continue to try to get the rules in place that keep the advantage in the hands of his party and of the majority. And, this is one of those things where you might not like this, or you might be a traditionalist or whatever, but, politicians are politicians, and advantage is what you're seeking in a legislative body, and that's how you get it here. And I think, the first vote of the Senate is always on its rules. It's a straight majority vote. It's not a 2/3 vote or any 3/5 vote or any of that kind of stuff. It's a straight up majority vote, and they vote on the rules. And you can expect the majority to vote for the rules that favor that majority. And I think this is going to be one of them.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about redistricting and focusing on Congress, and that's going to make the maps for the 38 or 39 seats that Texas is going to get in the next apportionment. Before we get there, though, we still have some competitive races this cycle, a lot more than, say, 4 years ago. 4 years ago, I think most people would have said Texas, out of its 36 U.S. House districts, had one competitive race: Congressional District 23, San Antonio, down to Eagle Pass, and then out to the lower El Paso Valley. This time around, most national pundits at least put about 12 seats in the mix of varying levels of competitiveness. What seats are you focused on that are most likely to flip from Democrat to Republican, or Republican to Democrat more likely? Cassie?
A lot of attention has kind of been on TX21. Chip Roy, a Republican, currently represents that district. Wendy Davis, former state senator, formerly ran for governor, is running for that seat. That's I guess all of these congressional seats, you could make an argument that they're drawn pretty interestingly, and that they have their own quirks. But this one, includes Austin, Travis County, but then it also includes some of the rural areas that have voted typically, have a more conservative voting track record. So that's an interesting one that I think, just has gotten a lot of play. A lot of national money is coming into that race. In Dallas County, you have TX32, Colin Allred, Genevieve Collins. Colin Allred's the Dem that flipped that seat last time. And then, in Houston, Dan Crenshaw's seat, Republican, has really made a national brand for himself just as a freshman. And, the Democrat challenging them has made a pretty serious play for the seat in terms of resources and messaging and whatnot.
Ross, some other ones?
Yeah, we had a thing that everybody in Washington was calling the Texodus. 6 members of the Texas congressional delegation decided not to run for re-election. All 6 of them are Republicans, and 3 of those seats are in districts that, basically you'd have to run a terrible campaign to lose it as a Republican. But 3 of them have created open seats that I think the Democrats have a really good shot at winning. One of them is the Pete Olson seat in Fort Bend County, and the Kenny Marchant seat up in northwestern Dallas County. The District 23, Will Hurd decided not to run again. It was already a swing district. Will Hurd narrowly won it last time. A lot of us, and I'd put myself in that group, thought he would probably be in trouble this time. The demographics have changed somewhat. The Chip Roy seat. One of the things that we see in common in each of these districts is a blue metro area kind of bleeding voters into what had been a red suburban area. Fort Bend County used to be one of the crown jewels for Republicans in Texas, and is now a toss-up county, arguably a Democratic county. They elected a couple of countywide Democrats last time, including the county judge, who displaced a longtime Republican. The Kenny Marchant seat up in northwestern Dallas County used to be, again, another solidly Republican area. The geography here is competitive both in the congressional race and in the underlying Texas House race. The District 23 stretches all the way from San Antonio to El Paso. It takes in this giant swath, the biggest part of the Texas-Mexico border, But really, the place where you win or lose that race is in San Antonio, and it's another one of those. It's another part of Bexar County that's got some of the same thing, where a blue city is kind of leaching into the suburbs. And then finally, that's certainly the case in the Chip Roy Wendy Davis race. This is a district that was drawn for Lamar Smith in Congress. Lamar Smith won exactly this geography by 22, 23, 24 points every time he ran for re-election. But the suburban growth has come from Austin, where housing is expensive and where you get a more liberal voter moving into what had been a red district, and now it's a competitive one.
Thanks. So let's think so I guess one final question would be, when we're looking at the Texas House, if you had to make a prediction today, you've gun to your head, forced to make a prediction, does it stay Democratic or does it stay Republican? Does it flip Democratic, or are you tied? Where would you expect it today? Knowing that there's going to be a margin of error around this projection that could take it over to the other side quite easily.
I'm going to be a big chicken and say ladies first.
Well, okay. So, Mark, I'm not going to answer your question, but I have a good reason why. And my answer is I don't know. And here's why I don't know.
Right.
I don't think anybody in the House knows, Republican, Democrat. And the way that the reason why I know that they don't know is because of the speaker's race. Everything's in the context of the speaker's race. You haven't had a single candidate file from either party because they're not sure if their party's going to be in control come November 3rd. And that's what, you talk to Republicans, Democrats, freshmen, some of the more senior members, that's what it's all hinging on is what's going to come of November 3rd. When are we going to have results? And the usual line that follows that is, as soon as we know which parties control, expect a flood of filings with the Texas Ethics Commission that could come as soon as election night if results are in. So I hope that answer is adequate.
Oh yeah, Ross?
Yeah, she's very good at this. Listen to a lot of politicians answer questions. I think that like I said earlier, I think that getting the House in Democratic hands would take a really big night for the Democrats. Our polling right now has President Trump ahead of Joe Biden, our most recent poll, by 5 points. John Cornyn ahead of MJ Hagar by 8 points. We did a couple of generic ballots where we said in a race in your district for Congress or for the legislature between an unnamed Democrat and an unnamed Republican, both of those races came back with a 7 or 8 point Republican advantage. So I think it's it would take a hat trick for the Democrats to get a majority here. But I go back to Cassie's point of earlier. Either way, this is going to be a very closely divided House and is going to be a more moderated House and is going to come into this legislative session, serving as a break, whether it's a partisan break or just an ideological break with the state Senate. And then we go into redistricting. One thing I want to point out is that everybody who's a freshman after this election, the winners of this election who win for the first time, are going to be the cannon fodder in political map drawing. When the legislature comes in and draws maps, the first thing they do is they take care of incumbents. And the first incumbents they take care of are the ones who've been around for a while. The new people, whether you're talking about Congress, the Senate, or the House, the new people are the ones who often end up with the short end of the stick. So, the victories here might be important for the next 2 years, but they might also be short-lived.
Thanks, Ross. So I guess that segues into, I think, one of the first questions we have from the audience, and maybe you can take this, Ross, as well. So the question relates to when we get redistricting. That is, since for the State House and State Senate, the Texas Legislative Redistricting Board will be the default institution if the House and the Senate, if a Democratic House and a Republican Senate can't come to an agreement. Does this matter for the drawing of does control of the House matter for the drawing of for the next decade's House district, Texas House and Texas Senate districts, even while it may matter more for the U.S. House because it would likely kick it into the courts if there's not agreement between the House and Senate?
This really, really quickly gets into the weeds. It depends on when the census is delivered to the state. And there's a legal term of art there that I'm going to let the lawyers litigate, and I'm sure they will. But if the census was delayed, which it was, and if delivery of the census doesn't happen in what is legally regarded as a timely manner, then the Texas legislature doesn't have to draw maps during its regular session next year. It can draw them in special session. If that's the case, we never get to the Legislative Redistricting Board until after the 2023 session, because the way the law is worded, it says if the legislature in a regular session can't draw maps, then they go to the Legislative Redistricting Board. If you don't have a census to draw the maps during a regular session, then you can't have a Legislative Redistricting Board. In that case, the Democrats are betting that the legislative maps would, instead of going to this panel of 4 Republicans and a Democrat, or 5 Republicans in the worst case, they're betting that they would instead go to the courts and that they might have a better shot in the courts. The congressional maps go to the courts either way. They don't go to the Legislative Redistricting Board. So really it depends on the timing of when the census is delivered in the legal sense to the Texas legislature and how fast it can act on maps, and whether that goes to a panel of Republicans or to a courtroom full of judges, some of whom might be Democrats.
Okay, so, and we now have some questions on some specific races. So one's more generally, Cassie, is there any hope for Democrats in East Texas? I guess outside of Joe Desatel.
I would say that their chances of winning anything in the more rural parts of the state are probably not as high, not as great as the races that we've been talking about for the past few minutes in these suburban, in these urban areas of this, the state.
Okay. Ross, do you agree?
Yeah, if you look at a map after the elections in Texas, it looks like a big Texas-shaped bowl of tomato soup with blueberries in it. And the blueberries aren't in the rural areas. The blueberries are in Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, Fort Worth. So I think that rural Texas remains pretty red. And, a lot of those members are running without real opposition.
Okay, and so another district, Jonathan Stickland's old district, 92 up in the HEB area of Tarrant County. There's Jeff Cason's the Republican, and is it Jeff Whitfield is the Democrat? What are the prospects there? Does Whitfield have a chance of taking Stickland's old seat?
Democrats certainly think so, and I think Republicans are aware of the fact that this is a seat in play for them. Take the money race for what it is. Apply the necessary caveats. It's not telling of the entire story, but Cason is more aligned with the hardline faction, I like to call it, of the GOP, which is what Stickland was, and I think he's been campaigning as such. He ended the most recent campaign finance period with, I think, $1,300, maybe $1,500 cash on hand. I know the Trib's Patrick Spitek did a roundup of races, and I think that was 0.55%. That cash on hand total was 0.55% of what Jeff Whitfield, the Democrat opponent, had on hand. And, that's going into election day. And of course, last minute, infusions can come in and really boost a candidacy. But, if you're just looking at the money numbers, it definitely looks like it's within striking distance for Democrats.
Okay. And so one question, let's get into sort of policy set wide. So how, regardless of which option, we're going to have a very, as we mentioned, a house that's very balanced, that it may be tilting a little Republican, maybe tilting a little Democrat. How is that going to affect the ability to pass bills related to the COVID-19 pandemic? So sort of vaccine access, funding for it, funding for public health services, additional COVID testing. How is that going to affect the overall policy process as it relates to COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19?
I think this is one of those issues, if you are careful in the partisan minefield, I think this is one of those issues that's going to cut across party lines. Everybody wants to address the pandemic. Everybody wants to keep people safe. Everybody wants the economy to work, and everybody wants to keep their personal freedom. And you've just got to find a place to get them together and try to avoid, some of these things that have become landmine issues. I think it's going to be very hard to get contact tracing established in a widespread enough way to work in Texas, because you just run into civil libertarians and with some issues there. But you could certainly do more than the state's doing now, particularly in schools, colleges, institutional settings like that. Masks seem to have come along a little bit. There's a lot of response that the state still needs to address in terms of getting the right materials and everything in place in hospitals, in terms of settling on some of the criteria and some of the local criteria for opening and closing businesses and what's allowed and what's not allowed. I think there's a lot of room to work there that doesn't necessarily start with somebody saying I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. But, you know, the legislature kind of goes with the wind. And if we come out of this election wanting more or emphasizing more partisan politics, by we, I mean the voters, we're going to get that. And if we come out of this election saying, boy, had enough of that, let's get some work done. COVID is one of the places where, you know, we're going to see how that works, how that comes out.
Okay, and then along those lines, there's a question about, does it really make a difference from a policy? We know it makes a difference maybe on redistricting, but from a policy perspective, how much of a difference does it make whether the Democrat is a partisan Republican with a narrow Republican majority or a partisan Democrat with a narrow Democratic majority? Cassie?
You know, big picture view, I'm not anticipating that big of a difference. I think maybe one of the most notable things that you know, a Dem speaker or a Dem majority would bring would be a Democratic chair for House Appropriations, right, overseeing the budget. You could expect a slightly different or very different, depending on who the appropriations chair is, of what the House budget looks like. You know, Democrats have typically, you know, criticized Republicans for not putting enough into, you know, health and human services, you know, spending too much on border security, stuff like that. So, you know, that's one area that I think you could see quite a bit of daylight. But, you know, to go back to the point that Ross just made, I think the issues are pretty much, you know, on the table for both parties in terms of what everybody is walking into next session wanting to at least work on as a body, redistricting, COVID response, you know, trying to figure out how to navigate these shortfalls that are projected, you know, and then a few other, you know, party specific issues. We'll see if there's even time, you know, for those issues to get any play.
I don't think we're going to get a wingnut speaker. I think that's the deal with this House. I think if we get a narrow majority for either party, you're going to get a speaker who's closer to the middle, a moderate Republican or a moderate Democrat, rather than a very conservative Republican or a very liberal Democrat. And I don't think you're going to get the kind of, you know, I don't think you're going to get a fire-breathing partisan in the speaker's role out of this election.
Okay. And then, so one other district question, 134, Ann Johnson lost to Sarah Davis before. What's different this time around?
I would say the national climate is probably what's different this time around. And, you know, what effect, if any, Trump has in that district. The district has proven, like I said earlier, with Beto O'Rourke carrying it by over 20 points in 2018 and Sarah Davis still winning her own reelection. It's a unique district. I suppose you could make the case about all of them if you really wanted to, but one that definitely stands out in my book. And, you know, I think that's probably the big difference here is who's in the White House at this point.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, Sarah Davis has outperformed the top of the ticket, you know, pretty consistently here. And you're going to have to get, you know, we know that 100-year flood won't drown her. You're going to have to get a 500-year flood here, and I don't see that. I do think Trump's going to lose that district. And I think he'll, you know, you know, which is what her problem is. But she's been, you know, she's done a pretty good job of navigating that so far.
No, yeah, she definitely has. If there's anyone who has an independent profile in the Texas legislature, it's Sarah Davis. Okay, so thinking about then some of the Republicans that we've seen criticizing President Trump, there's a question about, do these never Trumpers or Trump critics have any future in Texas politics in the Republican primary? Would they be able to win a GOP primary in 2022 or 2024? Or has essentially their opposition to Donald Trump, vocal or otherwise, ended any possible career for them in the Republican Party in the near term.
If Trump loses this election, he's going to be blamed for losing any Republican seat that gets lost. And associating with him isn't going to be an asset to a candidate in a future election. If Trump wins this election, loyalty counts, right? And, that's the bet everybody's making. That's why so many of them have vapor lock right now. They can't decide which way to go, because if you cross the guy and he wins, you're dead. If you stick with the guy and he loses, you're dead. And I think a lot of them are just, stuck. We're seeing more people as more polls come out and we get closer to the election, creating a little bit of distance, or trying to. John Cornyn did this the other day, talking to the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, saying, well, I've opposed him, but I've done it privately because I think that's more effective. I'm sure if you're in the White House and you're reader number one, that's being read as opposition. I'm sure he wasn't very happy about that. But Cornyn's looking at polls and Trump's looking at polls, and they know what they're doing. And, the answer to your question really depends on who wins on November 3rd.
Okay, so there's a question here. You brought it up. We both Cassie, you and Ross have mentioned that the next speaker is going to be a moderate. So the senator, Dan Patrick, is not up for re-election until 2022. So how is that moderate in the House going to get along with the more conservative Dan Patrick in the Senate?
Unclear at this point, and I think a lot of it depends on what the lieutenant governor and the Senate's appetite is for drama. Or I guess, quite frankly, what sort of appetite either chamber is going to have for drama, and it goes back to almost every member acknowledging that this is probably going to be their toughest session that they've either been through or that they've been through in years, right? I think the last one that some members were here for was 2011, and the cuts to public education and the shortfalls that they were dealing with there. If history is any sort of indication, when Joe Strauss was speaker, especially in 2017, when you had a pretty controversial session just with the issues that kind of came to define it, you had a pretty interesting back and forth on a number of occasions between former Speaker Strauss and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. So I don't know if we're going to have a repeat of that, just given that we're in a kind of a different set of circumstances, given the work on everybody's plate and the I don't think there's going to be much talk or much room for the quote unquote social red meat issues that we were talking about in 2017. So
Ross?
We've got a really gnarly budget, as Cassie points out. And, within a budget fight, they're really fighting about programs and services. And we have this amount of money. We have these things that we want to do. All the things that are in the budget now are things that the voters want. They got them out of a very conservative legislature. And when you come back and you say, we don't have enough money to do all those things, do you want to cut public education? Do you want to cut health and human services? Do you want to cut prisons? Do you want to cut transportation? All the choices are lousy. So they've got plenty to fight over there. They're going to be either in the regular session or in the special session doing redistricting, which is the most political, partisan, straight up fighting material that a legislature ever gets. And they're doing all of this, with all of these existential external problems at the same time, a pandemic, a recession, the calls for racial justice that I think will show up either in terms of, or probably both in terms of racial justice and law enforcement, some climate law. And then the last thing I would throw into that is we're not even sure how they're going to meet. You can't go in the Texas Capitol right now. The normal full Texas Capitol, when it's really banging and the House is in and the Senate's in and the Capitol cafeteria is going and the hallways are stuff, there's 6,000 people in that building. And they're talking about, do we do temperature checks? Who do we let in? Who do we not let in? Can we hold public hearings? I don't know that there's going to be a lot of time for red meat issues. I think, you'll get to some of that with redistricting, satisfy that appetite, whatever it is. You'll get to some of that certainly in the budget. But a lot of this is, meat and potatoes, do your job kind of stuff.
Yeah, we have a question here that I think it's an original question, then I'll add a second part to it. Is the question from the viewer is, how long will Paxton last as Attorney General? And I'd add on to that, if Dan Paxton does not resign, would you see impeachment anytime on the horizon, or is that not in the cards? Ross?
Impeachment comes from the House. Tell me who's going to win the election in November. And, that's the kind of thing where a moderate Democrat who is the speaker is going to be under some pressure from the partisans to go after the Attorney General. It looks like some of the Attorney General's allies have been peeling on him. I mean, after it became known that that his problems involve alleged favors he did as Attorney General for someone who contributed to his campaign, a number of other Republicans, starting with Chip Roy, who's a congressman and also used to be Paxton's first assistant, Glenn Hager, the controller, Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, all ditched their contributions from this donor. And, that's, in some ways, that's the rats leaving the HMS Paxton. And I think, he's got some political problems both inside his own party and with the Democrats going forward on this. How long is he going to last? I don't know. This may all go away. Periodically we get scandals and they turn out to be something else, or they turn out not to be serious. I don't want to hazard a guess there, but he's in a very perilous political position.
Thanks. Cassie, you want to add anything on that?
I completely agree. I mean, you saw, from a legislature perspective, you saw Jeff Leach, House Judiciary Chair, longtime Paxton ally. They run on they have the same home turf up in North Texas, request his resignation effectively and requested a report from the AG's office asking how they're planning to conduct business with this, political scandal and legal scandal hanging over the office. So, I think first question is somebody like a Jeff Leach back in January, and is there any sort of pressure that committee, which has oversight or jurisdiction, I forget like what the specific terminology is, over the AG's office, whether there's any sort of pressure from that chair of that committee, put on the agency.
Okay, and then so one final question, we'll go all the way up to the top of the state. And so this is across the state. Do you see any Republicans losing statewide? And if you don't see, if so, which ones? And if you don't, who's going to come the closest to losing? And then here we can talk from President Trump all the way down to Justice Hack and down to the Court of Criminal Appeals. Ross?
I'll jump in first this time. I think you could. I think, this is one of those situations where the straight ticket counts. And by the time most people get down to judicial races, they don't necessarily know who they're looking at. And the biggest identifier is either the party identification or, somebody has a melodious name. It just looks great. This is where, candidates with, names like Stephen F. Austin do really well. But I think you could get, the Democrats put up pretty strong candidates for Railroad Commission, which is now an open seat because the incumbent Republican got beat in his own primary. Krista Castaneda versus Jim Wright. I think that's pretty close to a statewide toss-up. And I think, you could potentially see some surprises in the Supreme Court and Court of Criminal Appeals seats that are up at the top of the ballot, but below sort of the regular public visibility that politicians enjoy.
Cassie?
Yeah, I would agree completely with that. Democrats have a pretty competitive and Krista in that Railroad Commission race. And, with the incumbent out of the equation, it just has made it all the more, in the eyes, I think, of both parties, more competitive and more in play. And then, we saw what happened to all these judicial races in 2018, right? Are we going to have a repeat of that? And what's that going to look like for Republican incumbents?
Hey, thanks, Cassie. Ross, the clock struck 12:59, which is my signal to hand it back over to John Williams. Mike. Can't hear you. You're there you go.
I apologize. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. I enjoyed the show immensely, learned a lot, and I hope our audience did too. That concludes today's session. But before I leave, I encourage everybody to vote. It's the best way to express yourself, and democracy depends on it. Thanks so much, fellas.
Thanks.